So I was in where the Super Bowl was played, when was that, last Sunday? Yeah, whenever. I've been out of the country, sick for a while, feel great now, but I don't even know what day it is today. I think it's Sunday. So where the Super Bowl was played, the New Orleans Superdome, I was there for an event about 12 years ago. And I had told some friends of mine that I would get on the platform. I wasn't invited to be on the platform. I wasn't scheduled to be a speaker. In fact, I was just there. I was just a dude hanging out. But I told them, I just made a bet with them. I said, I'm going to figure out a way to get on the platform and just sit up there. And they were like, right, whatever. And I said, I'm going to get on the platform, and you're going to see me on the big Jumbotron in the Superdome. So that's what I set out to do. Little did they know I had a slight advantage because I did know the organizers of the event, but it didn't matter. I still wasn't a speaker or anything. So I ended up working my way backstage through a series of just me schmoozing different people that I knew, figured out a way to get backstage, and then got invited actually by a guy who was hosting this whole thing, got invited to just come and sit up on the platform for one of the sessions. I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't leading in silent prayer in the parking lot. I was doing nothing in this particular event, but he asked me to come up and sit on he just said, hey, you want to come up? I was like, yeah, I'll come up there and sit. So I'm backstage, and I made my way back there. I didn't have any credentials or anything, and I kind of came out to the side where the backdrop curtain is, and I started to come around the curtain, and there was security there, and they looked at me and they said, what do you think you're doing? And I said, I'm going to the stage. And they're looking at their thing and they're saying, what's your name? And I said, Max Lucado. No, I didn't say that. I'm just kidding. Jerry Gillis. And then he kind of looked and he went, I don't have you anywhere on the schedule. Are you a speaker? And I said, no. And he said, you're not getting on the stage, man. There's no chance you're getting on the stage. And I said, but I'm supposed to be there. He just kind of was like, who do you think you are? Think you're just going to walk up on the stage? You're not walking up on the stage. I was like, hey man, it's no problem. I got invited to be up there. Who invited you? And I told him the name, and he was like, I don't know. Sounds like, he said, look, you're not going to be able to get up on the stage unless I hear otherwise. So as I'm standing there, right around the corner, I kind of look like this, and the guy who organized the event is sitting up on the platform toward the back, and he looks over and he starts going, and I just kind of looked over there and I kind of tapped this guy on the shoulder. He looks over there and he's looking at me going, come on. And I kind of looked at the guy and I was like, and I walked up and I sat on the platform and I was on the Jumbotron and I was a hero to all my friends. So, I tell you that to tell you, I've had moments in my life where people have asked me the question, just who do you think you are? Have you ever had that? Well, this today, what we're going to be kind of looking at is kind of the unpacking that Luke is doing, because he gives us these glimpses into the uniqueness of Jesus, and he's teaching this to his friend Theophilus. We shorten that to Theo here because it's easier to say. Theophilus is inquiring about Jesus. Luke is filling him in on this. And from the very beginning, he's starting to help us understand the uniqueness of Jesus, the uniqueness of his birth and everything that surrounded it, the uniqueness of his preteen years when he got separated from his parents, and now his parents come back saying to Jesus, basically, this is a little bit of a paraphrase, who do you think you are? And then we see the uniqueness of Jesus in his baptism. Then we see the uniqueness in the temptation in the wilderness where Satan himself is kind of saying in a backdoor way, who do you think you are? Then we see Jesus at Nazareth where he's preaching and unveiling the fact that he's the Messiah, but the people of Nazareth are looking at Jesus going, who does he think he is? And now we are going to be introduced to a group of people that Jesus is confronting called the Pharisees. Now, if you don't know who they are, the Pharisees were the religious leaders of the day. And they were really serious about what they did. They seemed to be a pretty stodgy, stuffy group. And they were real concerned about everybody obeying every aspect, not just of God's law, but laws that they themselves had made up in order to keep people from breaking God's laws. They didn't think apparently God's law was enough by itself as a standalone. They created all of these fence laws or buffer laws. So now you're like 10 laws out from actually breaking the law. But if you're breaking these, they're looking at you like you're doing something horrific. So these Pharisees are going to be kind of the bane of Jesus' existence. They're a part of the religious establishment. They have misunderstood God. They have misunderstood God's laws and the point behind them. And now you're going to see through the Gospels this collision with Jesus and the Pharisees. In fact, when you get into chapter 5 of the Gospel of Luke, we're going to be in chapter 6, but when you get into chapter 5 in the Gospel of Luke, you see Jesus actually healing a man who was paralyzed. They lowered him through a roof, to get to Jesus because the crowds were so big. And Jesus, he not only with this man, he not only raised him up so he could walk, but he also told him his sins were forgiven because of his faith in Jesus. Now, the Pharisees basically say this to Jesus: who do you think you are? They're talking to other people. Who does this guy think he is? You can't blaspheme like that. Only God can forgive sins. Who does this guy think he is? So now you see the setup of this confrontation with the Pharisees, the religious establishment, and Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, who's breathing life and breathing truth into the world. And you see kind of a conflict. But it's interesting. Now, in the later part of chapter 5, Jesus is at a party. And Jesus was at a party at a guy named Levi's house. We know him as Matthew as well. And he was a new follower of Jesus. He was a tax collector. He didn't have a whole lot of friends. Nobody particularly, he had a lot of friends, but not the kind of friends that you would want to have. Except he has a party and invites all of those friends that you wouldn't want to have to his house, because those are the only kind of people that liked him, because he was a tax collector and nobody really liked a tax collector. So he's hanging out with people probably that other people don't like as well. And so all the people that other people don't like are now all friends together. And they're all at Levi's house. And so is Jesus. And while he's there, the Pharisees, who apparently are just trying to track Jesus wherever he's at, because they didn't go to these types of parties, start quizzing and peppering Jesus and his disciples with questions about, hey, why in the world would you hang out with a group of ragtag sinners like this? And why in the world would you also not be fasting like John's disciples do, like the Pharisees do? Why aren't you and your disciples, why aren't you fasting all the time? Well, Jesus kind of answers that question by helping them understand that something new is about to transpire. And he says in chapter 5, beginning in verse number 33, it says, they said to him, John's disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours go on eating and drinking. And Jesus answered, can you make the guests of the bridegroom fast while he's with them? But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. In those days they will fast. And then he told them this parable. No one tears a patch from a new garment and sews it on an old one. If he does, he'll torn the garment, and the patch from the new will not match the old. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins. The wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, new wine must be poured into new wineskins. And no one after drinking old wine wants the new, for he says, the old is better. See here, Jesus is basically saying this. You're asking me all these questions, but I'm here to tell you that I'm doing something completely new. I'm doing something that's completely different. And he tells them this parable and basically says, look, you can't mix the new and the old, because in doing that, you're going to ruin both of them, right? You're going to tear a piece of a new garment to patch it on an old garment. That's not going to make sense. Then you've ruined the new garment. And by the way, you've also ruined the old garment, because that new one's not going to fit well, because when you wash it, it's going to shrink and it's going to tear it up worse. It's not going to work. And he said, new wineskins and old wineskins. He said, you can't do this. You can't put new wine into an old wineskin. It's going to burst it. He said, you got to put new wine into a new wineskin. This is a part. He says, you're going to destroy both if you start mixing and matching. Jesus was saying this. I didn't come to put a patch on Judaism. I didn't just come to put a patch on this religion. And I didn't come to start a new religion. I didn't come here to start some new institution or some new religion. That's not what I'm doing. I'm doing something completely and totally brand new. I am the Messiah, the Son of God, and I am coming so that the inbreaking of the kingdom of God will show up in this world, doing something different so that I can now feasibly show you the way home to the Father. This is what I'm coming to do. I'm not coming to make up a new religion. I'm not coming to put a patch on an old religion. I am breaking in and doing something completely and totally new. So everybody's minds are just kind of going, whoo. It's hard to get that. When something is completely new, it's hard to understand. And the Pharisees, because they had a paradigm and because they had an institution and because they had a way of understanding the truth that was flawed and a way of understanding God that was flawed, they had trouble with Jesus. He just didn't make a lot of sense to them. He seemed like kind of a rebel with a cause, so to speak, and they were really concerned about him. So we see all of that, and then we understand that they are going to now face-to-face confront Jesus over a number of different things, but one of the bigger things that they were always confronting Jesus with was this idea of the Sabbath. Now I want you to pause for a second. The Sabbath was given by God to his people Israel, and it was an opportunity one day a week on Saturday for his people to rest from their work, cease from their labor, to worship, to be able to reflect on the fact that God is the sustainer and the provider of everything that is, and that they aren't just the ones that are providing for themselves, but they can stop and reflect that God is the provider. God gave this to his people Israel for their benefit and for his own glory. It was a testimony to the nations. But Sabbath by the time of Jesus had become something much more complex. The religious leaders of the day now, because there were some rules about what you should do and shouldn't do on the Sabbath that God said, they added to those an obnoxious amount of rules about what you could do and what you couldn't do, and interpreting what is work and what is not work. And so basically the Sabbath almost became this fearful, heavy, burdensome thing to do. You had to be so careful about everything. Well, I can only walk a certain amount of steps. Well, I better not do this, or I better not do that. And it was that kind of idea, but Jesus is going to blow their idea of this thing called Sabbath out of the water. And he's going to show them why, because he's doing something completely new. So we understand that when we begin to read in chapter 6, and I want you to look beginning in verse number 1, it says this. It says, one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? And Jesus answered them, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now this is interesting because he's face to face with the Pharisees, and they're complaining because Jesus and his companions are walking through the grain fields, and they're picking the heads of grain and rubbing them, and they're eating, okay? This is what they're doing. Now you would think to yourself, why are they getting so bent out of shape about this? Well, the book of Deuteronomy does give, and I won't go into detail there, but the book of Deuteronomy does give some instruction around these things. And you do have permission, by the way, according to the book of the law, the book of Deuteronomy, you do have permission to go through the grain fields and to pick the heads of grain if you're kind of passing through, even if they're not your own, and if you're hungry or whatever, and you can eat those. You're allowed to do that, but you're not allowed to take all of that stuff with you when you leave. It's kind of like as you're passing through, if you want to do that, you can, but don't take it with you. In other words, to work against stealing, where everybody's just kind of grabbing up everybody's stuff. It's one thing to come through there and, maybe get something to eat on a long journey. It's another thing to kind of rip them off because they're farming this land, right? So they were allowed to do this, but here's the problem. The Pharisees apparently took their taking this and rubbing it in their hands as threshing, and that they were actually harvesting, which constitutes work. Don't you love those kind of people? I know I never run into them today in this day and age. Like the God FBI. But my question is also, what were the Pharisees even doing out in the grain field with Jesus and his disciples? I know what they were doing. They're tracking him. Just like they wanted to sneak around and see what he was doing when he was at Levi's house. What are they doing at a party like that? They wouldn't go to those kind of parties. They're too godly for that. But they've got this teacher who's threatening everything. He's basically teaching that he's turning the world upside down, that he's turning up their institutions upside down, that he's doing something brand new in the world. And he's so compelling that they are just following him around everywhere, trying to catch him in what he is doing, because it's going to mess with their understanding of God. It's going to mess with their way of life. And so there they are in the grain fields. And they start complaining. Why do you do what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Their hands had to be on their hips when they asked. Jesus, I need a good explanation here. Why in the world are your disciples doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Jesus begins by using this phrase. Have you never read... These are Pharisees. They're brilliant. They're scholars of the Bible. This is what they are. Their livelihood, who they are as human beings, their identity is tied up in their knowledge of the law of God. And Jesus breaks out, have you never read, as a starter? Love it. He says, have you never read about David and what happened with David and some of his men? If you remember, David had been already anointed king by Samuel, but it had not come into play. He had not received the crown because Saul was still on the throne. Do you remember that? Saul did not like David. David was a threat to Saul's kingdom. David wasn't trying to be a threat, but Saul was threatened by him to the point where he wanted to murder him. He wanted to track him down and kill him. But God is the one who saw David, and God is the one who was making David king, and we knew that eventuality was going to come about. But David's a bit on the run, and we see in 1 Samuel chapter number 21 what Jesus is referencing in the story. It says this, David went to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech trembled when he met him, and he asked, why are you alone? Why is no one with you? And David answered Ahimelech the priest, the king sent me on a mission and said to me, no one is to know anything about the mission I'm sending you on. As for my men, I've told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find. They were starving. But the priest answered David, I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women. David replied, indeed, women have been kept from us as usual whenever I set out. The men's bodies are holy even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today? So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away. Now one of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord. He was Doeg the Edomite, remember that name. He was Doeg the Edomite, Saul's chief shepherd. Now, here's what Jesus is referencing. He's referencing David being with his men are not with him. He goes to the priest. He says, I'm starving. The priest says, I don't have anything to eat except for the showbread. David says, well, we'll take it. They didn't have anything to eat. Now, Jesus is, when the Pharisees are referencing Jesus and his disciples breaking the law, Jesus says, have you ever read about David? Because here's what he knows about the Pharisees. This answer, by the way, Jesus referring to this story, there's like levels of significance here that Jesus is talking about. So here's the first level of significance. He says, have you ever read that story? Because here's what he knew about the Pharisees. The Pharisees revered David. David was a king of Israel. Are the Pharisees going to say David was a sinner? David broke the law and was a sinner? No, they're not going to say that. Do you know why? Because in their mind, here's what they say. David didn't really formally break the law. He kind of technically broke the law, but not formally broke the law, because David was actually the rightful king of Israel. Jesus was basically saying to the Pharisees, hey boys, have you ever read about David? Because in a backdoor way, Jesus was saying, you don't really condemn him for doing this, because you know why? You knew that he was the rightful king of Israel. Well, what about the rightful king of the universe? Do I have a right to do this? I am a king in the line of David who is greater than David. You going to condemn me for that as well? So he kind of helps them understand that level of significance. But then he also helps them understand that it's not just about the letter of the law, it's also about the spirit of the law. You see, David's intent was that he and his men, they were starving. They were on the run. They needed something to eat. This was like their best option. He wasn't trying to break the law to break the law. He was hungry and he needed something to eat, and he was on a mission from God, and he was a man anointed and called by God. Well, certainly Jesus is the same, and we actually have record in the Old Testament of God seeing people's hearts even when they have violated the law that he has laid down. If you remember a king called Hezekiah, he came after David. Hezekiah came after a king called Ahaz. Ahaz, bad. Hezekiah, good. Okay, that's how I'll help you remember that. Because sometimes you hear all these names and you're like, I don't know who these people are, right? So here you go. Ahaz, his dad. Hezekiah, right on, all right? What Ahaz did is he built all these pagan shrines and pagan temples, and the temple worship wasn't practiced and everything went to pot. And then Hezekiah comes along and he restores all of these things. And he's bringing things back to where they're supposed to be. And listen to what is said in 2 Chronicles chapter 30. Although most of the many people who came from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, and Zebulun had not purified themselves, yet they ate the Passover contrary to what was written. In other words, he called them all back to the worship at the temple and to observe the Passover, but they hadn't purified themselves, but he called them back anyway, and they ate the Passover contrary to what was written. But Hezekiah prayed for them, saying, "May the Lord who is good pardon everyone who sets their heart on seeking God, the Lord, the God of their ancestors, even if they're not clean according to the rules of the sanctuary." And the Lord heard Hezekiah and healed the people. See what happened there? There were some rules, but their hearts were pure. Their hearts were to worship God. There had been a breaking down of all of that. And so Hezekiah says, come, let's restore. And technically, they broke some rules in terms of their cleanliness when it came time to eat the Passover. But Hezekiah said, God, would you have mercy, because their hearts are set on worshiping you. And God heard their prayer and he healed the people. What a beautiful picture. So Jesus is not only referring to this story to help us understand that he is a king in the line of David and he can do what he sees fit to do, but he's also saying you also have to understand the spirit of the commands, not just the letter of the law. And then kind of a third level of significance is that Jesus was reminding the Pharisees when he referred to that story that he knows exactly what they're up to. You remember Doeg the Edomite, Saul's chief shepherd, who was there when David went to the priest and ended up getting the showbread? Well, notice what happens a little bit later in that story in 1 Samuel 22. It says, Saul heard that David and his men had been discovered, and Saul was seated, spear in hand, under the tamarisk tree on the hill at Gibeah, with all his officials standing at his side. And he said to them, listen, men of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give you all the fields and vineyards? Will he make all of you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? Is that why you have all conspired against me? No one tells me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is concerned about me or tells me that my son has incited my servant to lie in wait for me as he does today. But Doeg, the Edomite, who was standing with Saul's officials, said, I saw the son of Jesse come to Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, at Nob. Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him, and he also gave him provisions and the sword of Goliath the Philistine. You know what he did? He spied and then went and told on him. That's what Doeg did. Doeg spied on David, and then he went and told on him. You know why Jesus is referring to this story? For multiple reasons, but one of them, he's saying to the Pharisees, I know what you're up to. You're spying on me just like Doeg did, and you're going to report to the authorities, and ultimately, you know exactly what transpired. They did that long enough where it took Jesus to a cross, right? So Luke is helping us see the foreshadowing of the cross and the beginning of the confrontation with the Pharisees here in chapter number 6. But then he gives us another story about Sabbath, because Jesus has made it really clear he is the Lord of the Sabbath. In other words, listen to this. The Sabbath is not Lord of him. He is Lord of the Sabbath. Did you catch that? That's the phrase that he's using there. Now look at the second story. It says, on another Sabbath, verse number 6, on another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and was teaching, Jesus was, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. Notice Luke's level of detail. As a doctor, he was concerned about which hand it was. Why? The right hand was the right hand. Right hand was always kind of the sign of power. Virtually it was a right-handed culture. Everybody was taught to be right-handed. In fact, the way that they would even talk about Jesus, he was seated at the right hand of the Father. This was the idea. Right hand was the sign of power and significance and those kinds of things. And Luke basically wants to point out to his readers, it was his right hand that was shriveled, the one you do everything with. This was a bigger deal than if it was the other hand, right? So Luke points that out. Verse 7, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, get up and stand in front of everyone. So he got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to them, I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it? He looked around at them all and then said to the man, stretch out your hand. He did so, and his hand was completely restored. But they were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do with Jesus. You can just hear at the end of this, right? This is what Luke's helping us set up. So there's another time where Jesus is at the synagogue. There's a man with a shriveled hand there. We don't know how he got there. We don't know if he was just a member of that particular synagogue and he was a part of that community, or if the Pharisees planted him there. They might have. They might have just wanted to make sure that there was a man with a shriveled hand there because they wanted to see if Jesus was going to heal on the Sabbath, because you can't heal on the Sabbath. That's work. And if you do work on the Sabbath, you are violating the Sabbath. So Jesus says, he sees the man with a shriveled hand, and instead of saying to this guy privately, hey bud, after we're done here and the Pharisees are gone, I want you to come and meet me over here. He could have done all that privately. Nope. He said, sir, would you stand in front of everyone? The Pharisees are thinking to themselves, okay, here we go. And then he says to the man, first saying to all the people, what's lawful to do on the Sabbath? To kill, destroy, or to give life? What's lawful to do on the Sabbath? And then he says to the man, sir, stretch out your hand. And the man stretches out his hand and he's healed. Do you know what's so frustrating about that to the Pharisees? Jesus did this without breaking any laws, even their made up laws. He didn't so much as touch this guy. He just said, stretch out your hand. The man stretched out his hand and he was healed. And Jesus was looking at the Pharisees going, and basically he's trying to remind them that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. This passage is teaching us this one kind of big principle. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not Lord of him. He is Lord over it. It is not Lord over him. And he's trying to help religious leaders who are woefully mistaken of their idea of God and what God has chosen to do. He's trying to help them understand these things. It's almost like being at the art gallery, the big presentation and the big show, and everybody kind of milling around to the various paintings. And one guy standing next to another guy who he doesn't know and looking at this painting saying, you know, I think it's really incredible that this painting reflects the depravity of humanity, the darkness of humanity. The guy standing next to him says, that's not what the painting says at all, actually. This painting is talking about the hope that there is for human beings ultimately, and the significance that they can find. This guy says, what? Your opinion's of no more value than mine. I'm the artist. That's basically what was going on here. They're arguing with Jesus over this idea of Sabbath, and in effect, he says this: I am the Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not Lord of me. I am the artist. I am the author. I understand its point. Stop arguing with me about all of these things. Well, if Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, and the Sabbath is not Lord over him, that can teach us a few things that I think we can use as takeaways when we walk out the door today. There are some lessons learned from this passage that attach to the idea of who Jesus is as Lord over everything that we need to remember. And here's the first one. In this passage, here's what we learned: that legality is not always the same thing as morality. Legality is not always the same thing as morality. You see, what was happening is there were a bunch of man-made laws that the Pharisees had, and they wanted everybody to fulfill those. But just because they were legal did not necessarily make them moral. You see, if we could say it this way, there are things that are legal that are sinful, and there are things that are illegal that aren't sinful. You'll probably have to go back to that one, online or whatever, and just start going, what just happened? What did you say? Well, here's the thing. In our day and age, talking now, today, legality and morality are not necessarily the same thing. We need to understand that because this was the route of the Pharisees. You see, in our day and age, what the Pharisees did in their day and age is they made some laws that weren't really God's laws. They were their laws, trying to keep them from other laws. And so now it became an issue of your morality. If you didn't do the things that they said to do, then apparently you were immoral. See, in our day and age, it's a different thing. Here's the thing, if we can make something legalized, then it becomes normalized. And once it becomes normalized, people realize that it's become moralized. Think about it. How many of you in here are older than 65 or 65? You're older than 65. Some of you are going, I'm not telling nobody. All the ladies are like, all right, you remember, it didn't feel immoral to not wear your seatbelt back in the day, right? It wasn't immoral. You're just riding around in a car. You were just glad not to have, not to have to walk, not to have to ride your bike. I mean, what about back in Jesus' day? We would look back and go, it was immoral that they would carry those babies on those donkeys. That's unsafe. That's all they had. What are you talking about? They didn't have cars and seat belts and all this kind of stuff, but then we made laws about seat belts. And now because that's been normalized, now it's a moral issue, right? For people. Same thing can be said about our day and age with hate speech. Listen closely. I don't think you should hate anyone. Anyone. For any reason. Except the devil. I don't think you should hate anyone. But when you talk about what the scripture says are things that are sinful and things that are holy, I'm not making it up. I'm reporting what has been communicated through people who have known God and have been the foundation of our faith for 2,000 years. And now that can be reported in some countries as hate speech. And because it's now hate speech, it becomes legalized. And that legalization leads to normalization and ultimately leads to moralization. Abortion's the same way. While I'm here, we make it legal so that for many people, it doesn't become immoral at all. Because why? Because it's legal. Understand, by the way, that I know that the crowd that I'm talking to, that there's lots of people who've walked through this, and that there's grace for you. There's mercy. There's forgiveness. There's hope. But I want you to understand from a position of If we can legalize it, then ultimately people will view it as moral. You see, legalizing doesn't necessarily mean moralizing. They're not the same. Jesus was blowing holes in these man-made kind of trumps saying, I myself am the truth because I'm the artist. I'm the author. But when you start adding all of these kind of pieces around of the same equation as my truth, no. You don't understand. These are not all the same thing as what I am and what I've said to you. These are not all the same. So just because something is legal doesn't make it moral. Did you catch that? Let me give you a second thing. If Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, then every day is holy. Every day. It makes no sense, ladies and gentlemen, because I've had people ask me before, they've said, Jerry, how come we don't meet on Saturdays? Actually, not really anybody who actually attends here asked me that, but other people ask me that, because if you actually attend here, then you're not really complaining about it because you're here on a Sunday. Right? Hello. Then somebody says, why don't we meet on Saturdays? Because Saturday's the Sabbath. Yeah, Saturday is the Sabbath. Exactly right. Of course, there's some confused believers who actually talk about Sunday as the Sabbath. This is the Sabbath. No, it's not. The Sabbath was given to the Jews, and it was Saturday. That's what it was, okay? That was the day. The early believers had enough foresight to realize that Jesus was making everything new and that he was doing something completely different. And this wasn't just a patch on Judaism. This wasn't just some new religion he's starting. That Jesus came and exploded the mold, and he's saying, I'm doing something brand new here. And the early believers had enough foresight to say, you know, when we're gonna meet and gather and worship, we're gonna meet and gather on Sunday. You know why? Just to go to the Sabbath? No. The reason that they were doing that is because that's when Jesus got up from the dead, demonstrating that all things were new. So they would gather to worship on the resurrection day, Sunday. Why? Was it bad that they were departing from this idea of meeting on the Sabbath? No. There was even in the day of Paul, there was a lot of wrangling going on about, having to observe this day and do this. And Paul tried to help people understand from Colossians chapter number 2. He said this, don't let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. You see, ladies and gentlemen, listen, Jesus is our Sabbath. He himself is our Sabbath. Don't misunderstand. Do I think principally we look at this idea and there has to be a level of work and a level of rest? Absolutely. No doubt about that. But here's what I'm trying to say to you. All of those laws, I've been in Israel lots and lots of times. I have been on the Shabbat elevator lots and lots of times. The Shabbat or the Sabbath elevator is the elevator in a hotel that works on the Sabbath. And here's the thing, you get on it and it stops at every floor so that you don't have to work by pressing a button. Now, you go, oh, that seems crazy. It's not crazy at all to a Jewish believer. They don't find that crazy at all. They look at that and say, this is a part of honoring the Sabbath. But we as the people of Jesus understand that he came bringing a message completely and totally new. So I've been on those accidentally. When I first went, I got on the elevator, I was like, why is this stopping at every floor? I'm just doing this with the buttons and everybody's looking at me going, oh boy, it's not working. It's the deal. You want to try it? Nope. And they look graciously at me and they're like, he just doesn't know, right? Silly Americans over here, he doesn't understand. Granted. But man, all of these things that are surrounding, Jesus didn't intend, listen, he didn't intend for the Sabbath to become some burdensome, hard to tackle kind of thing. He himself is the Sabbath. Hebrews actually calls him the Sabbath rest for his people. That's who he is. So every day is holy, ladies and gentlemen. Some of you look at Sunday as the holy day. Every day is holy. Jesus is the Sabbath. He is Lord over the Sabbath. It is not Lord over him. Every day is holy because the risen Son of God lives inside of us. That means our work is holy. Our rest is holy. All of it is. Let me give you a last thing, and I'll finish. Write this down. Man, don't miss this part. here's part of what I think in the big picture Jesus was coming to do. Jesus isn't a rule giver. He's a life giver. And some of us have a really upside down way of looking at Jesus, and it's similar to the way that the Pharisees looked at God. They were looking at the Sabbath saying basically this, it was all negative in this way. You cannot eat that grain in the grain fields. I don't care if you're starving, I don't care, you cannot do it. You cannot heal someone on the Sabbath because it's the Sabbath. And Jesus is like, oh, okay, so we're not supposed to do good on the Sabbath? This is what you're saying? We're supposed to do evil instead of good? I can help this man, I can heal this man, but I'm not allowed to? I can't do good? So the Sabbath is functionally for not doing good? Jesus is basically saying, this is crazy, guys. You completely missed it because you've missed your understanding of who God is. And so for us, we have to not understand Jesus. Listen, folks, he's not a rule giver, he's a life giver. You see, the reason that he does what he does is that we might have life and may have it to the full. This is the point. But some of us view Jesus as a rule giver. In fact, there's kind of two angles to this. Let me use reading your Bible as an example, okay? There are some of you that really want to read your Bible and start reading every day or mostly every day and all of that kind of stuff. And if you miss a day, listen, if you miss a day, here's how you feel. You feel like you broke a rule. You didn't break a rule. It's not a rule. What you did is you missed an opportunity to more deeply get to know the one who loves you, to more deeply get to know the one who made you. You missed an opportunity in relationship, but you didn't break a rule. But that's how you view God sometimes. And the inverse of that is there are people who may come and hear me talk about how we need to get to know God through his word, and you don't want to touch it. You don't want to even start reading the Bible or even listening to it on audio if you're not much of a reader. You don't even want to start. You know why? Because you're nervous about all the rules. You're scared to death. It's like, man, if I start reading that, I'm going to know all the stuff now that I'm not supposed to do, and it's going to be a big bunch of rules that I can't follow, and I'm not going to be able to do it. You've missed it. Jesus isn't a rule giver. He's a life giver. Everything that he calls us to, every instruction that he gives us, every command that he lays on us is not to be a burden. It is to give you life. This is the point. He's Lord over it all. It's not Lord over him. Boy, when you start to understand that God has revealed himself in Jesus so that you might know life, you would understand where Peter was at when a bunch of other disciples, not the 12, but a bunch of other people who were purportedly following Jesus, they checked out because Jesus started telling them some things that were tough to hear. And they left. And Jesus says to his disciples, are you going to leave too? Are you going to check out also? And Peter says, where are we going to go? You are the only one that has the words of eternal life. Where are we going to go? You see, here's what Peter began to understand, that Jesus was a life giver, that what he taught brought life because he himself, ladies and gentlemen, is life. You see, sometimes we separate out and we think to ourselves, you know, I'm kind of living my life and I want to make God a part of my life. Don't make God a part of your life. He is your life. He's your very existence. He is your life. You can't make him some part of your life like you make, you know, your poker club and your Facebook social media accounts. He's not just part of your life, like your book clubs and your basketball teams. He is life. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. I tell you all of this to tell you, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not Lord of him. And when we adjust our understanding saying Jesus brought something completely new into what we understand, he was saying this to us. I didn't come here to burden you down. I came here to show you that there is Sabbath rest in me, and that when you know me, it's not about me giving you rules, even though Jesus gives us commands and gives us instructions, but he's not a rule giver, he's a life giver. Why do you think that I plead with you to spend time getting to know God and his word? Because I want you to know all the rules? No, because I want you to know what life looks like in Jesus. That's the point. So, you got to make a decision where you're going to stand. Are you going to stand in the long line of Jesus' disciples who finally began to understand that he is a giver of life and that he is Lord over everything? Or are you going to stand in the same line of the Pharisees who've got a very broken idea of who God is as this great rule giver, and you start creating more and more and more and more to try and somehow make yourself feel accepted or make yourself feel holy or whatever else it is, things that God never said, but that you've just made up thinking that they're the right things to do, and you've equated them with the reality of who God is, and it's caused you to look at God differently than you ought. Jesus is saying, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden. I'll give you a laborious set of laws to throw on your head to make you wish you never even came my direction. No. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden. I'll give you rest. I'll show you life. I'll teach you a new way of living. I'll fill you. I'll bring you joy and satisfaction. I can only do that. Let's bow our heads together. Before we leave, there's two things. If you've never come to a place of receiving Jesus, I want you to know this. You can't keep enough laws. You can't keep enough rules to somehow force him into allowing you into relationship with him. It is by his grace, his death on a cross to pay for your sins, his resurrection from the dead. That is the only way you can know the Father, is through Jesus Christ the Son, and it is an act of grace. You can't work for it. If you want to finally surrender yourself to that and acknowledge that, then when we dismiss in just a moment, if you're here on this campus, I ask you to come by the fireside room. We'd love to talk to you about that. If you're at the Lockport campus, Pastor Jonathan will give you some instruction about that. For the rest of us, I would just say this. Let Jesus shape your understanding of God, because Jesus is the fullness of God in bodily form. Father, I pray that you would teach us the reality of what it means for Jesus not only to be Lord of the Sabbath, but Lord over everything. And that we would always press into relationship with you through Jesus, because we know that every command that Jesus has given us, every instruction, every teaching is to bring life and to show us what a new kingdom looks like in the world that we live in. So Father, I pray you'd help us to reshape our imagination so that we begin to see you more clearly, not bogged down in a bunch of man-made deals, but to see the truth and the purity of who you are, so that we might know truth, that we would be sanctified by your truth. We trust you to do this in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you, folks. Have a great day.